June 14th, 1944. The heat over northern Luzon shimmered like a veil, bending the horizon into a mirage of trembling palms and broken sky as Corporal David Mercer crouched behind a fallen mango tree. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging until everything blurred, but he forced himself to stay still, listening to the low metallic rumble crawling somewhere beyond the ridge. His squad had been reduced to 7 men, exhausted, half-starved, and running on instinct more than strength, but Mercer was the only one carrying a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. A crude contraption welded from scavenged pipe, aircraft cable, spent artillery shells, and the stripped-down remains of a Japanese knee mortar. The officers called it unsafe. The quartermaster called it illegal. The battalion commander banned it outright. But the men whispered about it at night, Mercer's scrap metal launcher, the device he built with his bare hands in a jungle workshop, lit by fireflies and fear. He hadn't meant to become an inventor. Before the war, he had welded irrigation pumps on a tobacco farm outside Lexington, Kentucky. After basic training, he became a mortar man, then a kind of unofficial mechanic who could fix anything the jungle hadn't already eaten. But none of that prepared him for Luzon. The ambushes, the starvation, the mud, the coughing wounds that never healed. His unit had been fighting a retreat for 3 days straight, hounded by a Japanese Type 95 Heigo tank that moved like a metal ghost between the trees. Light armor, fast treads, and a gun that could turn an entire platoon into silence. They'd lost 2 men already. They would lose more if Mercer didn't try the thing strapped across his back. The jungle throbbed with cicadas, the sound pulsing in huge invisible waves as he adjusted the crude shoulder brace he had fashioned from a broken stretcher. The launcher was ugly, lengths of welded pipe, reinforced with jungle vines soaked in resin to keep the whole thing from shaking apart. The firing mechanism was nothing more than repurposed aircraft cable tensioned against a salvaged spring from a wrecked Willys Jeep. His ammunition was worse. Shrapnel-loaded canisters hammered together from broken mess tins and filled with nails, bearings and metal fragments stripped from a Japanese truck they'd destroyed last week. The weapon had no manual, only a guess, only faith, and the squad's survival hung on that fragile, reckless belief. Behind him, Sergeant Hart moved through the brush on his belly, whispering urgently, "Mercer, you see it?" Mercer didn't reply immediately. He tightened his grip on the crude handle, listening again. Then he heard it, treads grinding over roots, faint but approaching. The Heigo was positioning to cut off their escape route. If it reached the ravine first, they'd be boxed in with nowhere to run but the river, and half the squad couldn't swim. Hart's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the terrible knowledge that they had no options left. "If your thing is going to work," he rasped, "now's the damn time." Mercer thought of the night he built the first prototype, rain dripping through a shattered nipper roof, the glow of a single lantern, the sound of artillery rolling over the hills like old thunder. He'd scavenged everything he needed from abandoned supply caches and wrecked vehicles, but each time he tested it, officers shouted him down, warning him he'd blow his own arm off. The quartermaster had confiscated it once, only for Mercer to assemble another from whatever the jungle offered. Hart didn't stop him. Hart was the one who knew that invention was sometimes the difference between living and being remembered. The treads grew louder. Mercer rose slowly, inch by inch, until he could peer over the fallen trunk. The tank nosed through the bamboo, its turret swiveling lazily, the machine gun barrel already searching for movement. Sunlight glinted off its riveted armor plates. Its dark painted hull looked like the shell of some prehistoric beast that had crawled out of a forgotten age. The crew couldn't see him yet. He had maybe 15 seconds. He exhaled, braced the launcher against his shoulder, and pulled back the firing handle. The aircraft cable creaked, the spring inside shuddering as if unsure whether to obey. He whispered something under his breath, not a prayer, not a promise, but a wordless plea to the machine he had created, his companion through fear and desperation. Then he saw the tank commander rise from the hatch, scanning the canopy with binoculars. A moment later, the barrel swung toward the ravine. Mercer didn't think. He fired. The launcher bucked like a mule, nearly tearing itself out of his hands. The cable snapped forward. The canister shot from the pipe with a shriek that echoed between the trees. The backblast filled the air with grit and smoke. Hart ducked instinctively. The shot arced through the air, wobbling just enough to make Mercer's stomach drop. Then it hit the tank's side armor with a metallic crack and exploded into a storm of shrapnel. The scream from inside was immediate. The tank lurched violently, turret jerking sideways, the commander ducking into the hatch too late to avoid the blast that ripped across the rim. Smoke poured from the vision slits. Mercer could hear panicked shouting in Japanese, treads grinding unevenly as the tank slewed toward the ditch. Something inside had broken, something vital, and the machine hesitated like an animal whose spine had been cut. Hart's eyes widened in disbelief. "Holy hell, you hit the crew compartment!" Mercer didn't answer. He'd already loaded another canister, fumbling with trembling fingers. The tank still moved, inches at a time, stubbornly trying to realign itself despite the chaos inside. He fired again. This time the shot slammed against the rear hull, penetrating the thin armor above the engine. A burst of flame shot upward. The entire vehicle shuddered, then stilled. For a moment, the jungle froze. Then the first figure appeared, one of the Japanese crewmen, half-blinded, climbing from the hatch with blood streaming from his face. He collapsed on the turret. Another tried to crawl out behind him, coughing violently, slipping on the metal slickened with oil and blood. The shots hadn't killed them outright, but they had been crippled, blinded, deafened, thrown into chaos. Mercer lowered the launcher slowly, unable to believe what he'd done. Hart stared between the ruined tank and the man who had built the strange weapon. "They banned it," he muttered, still in awe. "Command said it was useless, dangerous, a scrap metal hazard. But damn it, Mercer, you just stopped a tank." But Mercer wasn't looking at Hart. He was watching the crewmen stagger, fall, and try to regroup. He felt neither triumph nor bloodlust, only the strange, hollow shock of a man who had built something out of desperation and watched it change the battle in a single heartbeat. The jungle wind whispered through the bamboo. The cicadas went silent, as if the entire forest realized something extraordinary had happened. Mercer wiped the sweat from his brow, steadied his breath, and finally spoke the words he hadn't let himself believe until now. "It works," he whispered. "It actually works." Hart clapped his shoulder. "Load it up, Corporal. We're not done yet." And somewhere beyond the ridge, more engines began to stir. The sound of distant engines rolled across the jungle like a low warning, a reminder that the destruction of one tank had not ended anything, only delayed the inevitable. Mercer knelt beside the fallen mango tree, hands shaking as he inspected the launcher for cracks. The firing pipe was scorched. One of the supporting welds bent just enough to make the whole structure groan when he lifted it. The vines holding the forward brace creaked like old leather, but it was still intact. It had survived a second firing. That alone felt like a miracle. Sergeant Hart slid beside him in the mud, panting. "Scouts say more armor's coming. Looks like a whole wing of them pulling up from the east trail. They're trying to sweep the ravine." He didn't add what they both knew, that the squad could barely hold their position for minutes, let alone an hour. Already 2 riflemen were tending wounds from the last firefight, and the heavy machine gun was out of belts. Only Mercer had something that could punch through steel, and even that something was barely more than a gamble built in desperation. Mercer swallowed, tasting metal at the back of his tongue. "How many?" Hart wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. 2 tanks for sure, maybe 3, plus infantry. The words pushed the squad toward a cliff edge of fear, but no one ran. Fortunes changed fast in the jungle. Men learned to cling to the slimmest hopes, even one built from scrap metal and luck. Private Sandoval approached, breathless. "Sergeant, Lieutenant Groom wants Mercer at the CP. Says it's urgent." Hart nodded and jerked his thumb. "Go, and take that contraption with you." Mercer hustled through the dense undergrowth toward the makeshift command post, a cluster of trees lashed together with tarps, maps pinned to roots and trunks. Lieutenant Groom stood over a field map, jaw clenched, dark stubble clinging to his chin like grit. When Mercer appeared, the officer didn't waste words. You did something out there, Groom said. I saw the smoke plume. Word is you crippled a Hargo. Mercer nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. Groom motioned toward the map. The Japanese force pushing this sector is scouting for our supply trail. If they reach that, our rear units get rolled up. Command assumed they'd never get armor this deep. They assumed wrong. He tapped the launcher with his boot. You've got one more shot at stopping them. Maybe two if that thing holds together. Mercer looked down at his creation. The welded joints were beginning to separate. The firing mechanism was stiff with grit and sweat. And the ammunition. There were only 3 canisters left, each one hastily packed and imperfect. Sir, it might blow apart on firing. Groom leaned in, voice gravelly. If those tanks get through, this jungle becomes a slaughterhouse. We don't have artillery. We don't have air support. We don't have a damn thing except you and that launcher. He paused. I won't order you to use it, but if you're willing... Mercer didn't let him finish. I'll do it. Groom nodded once, curtly, as though relieved, but afraid to show it. Good. Take Sandoval and Miller. Set up on the west ridge overlooking the switchback trail. Tanks will funnel through there. It's narrow enough they can't maneuver. If you hit them at the right angle, you'll force them to withdraw or stall the whole column. Sandoval and Miller appeared behind Mercer, already loaded with what little gear they had left. No one questioned the orders. No one questioned the madness of placing their lives behind a weapon assembled from junk. They only knew that the jungles of Luzon demanded everything: courage, improvisation, and sometimes a level of insanity that turned the tide. The trek to the ridge was grueling. Sweat soaked their uniforms. Leeches clung to ankles. Vines dragged across their faces like clutching hands. The roar of engines grew louder as they climbed, until even the leaves trembled with the vibration of tread and steel. Mercer reached the ridge and immediately dropped to the ground, crawling on elbows until he reached the edge. Below him, the narrow switchback trail wound like a spine through dense bamboo, the air humid with diesel fumes. The first tank hadn't appeared yet, but its engine noise resonated through the ground. Mercer studied the terrain. The trail narrowed between 2 jutting rocks, forcing any vehicle to slow as it squeezed through the gap. If he could strike just as the tank entered the choke point, the explosion might reflect inward, amplifying its effect. But timing was everything. Fire too soon, and the canister would bounce off harmlessly. Fire too late, and the tank crew would identify his position and turn the machine gun on them. Sandoval set the small pack of canisters beside him. They gleamed dully in the dim light filtering through the canopy. Each one was irregular, hand-hammered, filled with a mix of metal fragments that Mercer hoped would defeat the thin side armor of Japanese light tanks. Miller positioned himself behind a fallen log, rifle ready, though they all knew bullets were meaningless against armor. A sudden crack of bamboo, a burst of diesel fumes. The first Hargo crawled into view. Even from above, its presence was intimidating. A squat, angular beast of riveted plates and snarling machinery. Its turret swiveled lazily. The driver's viewports were open. The tank commander stood partially exposed, scanning the ridgelines with binoculars. Mercer pressed the launcher against his shoulder, felt the bruised muscle from the first 2 shots protest, and steadied his breath. Sandoval, he whispered. Set the wedge. The private wedged a thick branch beneath the rear support of the launcher to absorb recoil. Miller steadied Mercer's right side. The whole contraption felt unstable, unbalanced, barely worthy of being called a weapon. But Mercer had no doubts anymore. It had worked once. It would work again. The tank eased into the choke point. Mercer exhaled and pulled the firing handle. The spring snapped. The cable whipped forward. The canister shot out with a violent hiss that rattled the ridge. It arced downward, spinning, wobbling, then struck the exposed side plate just behind the turret. The explosion ripped through the trail like a thunderclap. Metal screamed. The commander's binoculars flew from his hands as he disappeared into the hatch. Flames burst from the side vents. The tank lurched sideways. Track grinding against rock. Smoke billowed from the viewing slits. The vehicle came to a dead stop, half blocking the trail. Sandoval let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "One shot," he whispered. "Just one." But Mercer wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the trail below where a second Hargo rolled into view, turret already rotating toward the ridge. The crew inside must have seen the explosion ahead. They were ready. "Back!" Mercer shouted. "They're going to open up." The second tank's machine gun spit a line of tracers across the ridge, carving through bamboo and showering splinters over the three men. Mercer yanked the launcher against his chest and rolled behind a thick root as bullets churned the earth where he'd been seconds before. Sandoval pressed flat against the ground. Miller cursed as debris stung his face. The turret gun roared again, the round slamming into the ridge with a force that shook loose dust and beetles from the canopy. Mercer felt the tremor run through his ribs. The second tank wasn't stopping. It maneuvered around the crippled lead vehicle and pressed forward, intent on clearing the trail by sheer momentum. Mercer forced himself back to his knees, though fear clawed at him with cold fingers. "Sandoval, next canister." The private slid it into his hand, eyes wide with terror. "Sir, that tank is already tracking us." "I know." Mercer set the canister into the launch pipe. His hands trembled. The welds groaned. The metal was hot, too hot. One more blast might tear the launcher apart. He steadied himself behind the log, sighting down the crude pipe at the second Hargo as it pushed closer to the choke point. Machine gun fire erupted again, chopping the air inches above his head. "Mercer!" Miller grabbed his arm. "They've got the angle now. One more burst and—" But Mercer had already tuned out the danger. His world had narrowed to the tank, the gap in the trail, and the split-second window he needed. He breathed once, twice, pulled back the firing handle. The launcher screamed as the cable snapped forward, and the canister blasted out, trailing sparks. It struck the Hargo's front plate just above the driver's viewport and detonated in a burst of shrapnel and fire. The explosion threw the tank backward, the turret ringing like a bell struck with an iron hammer. Smoke poured out of the seams. The machine kept moving, barely, but zigzagged before grinding to a halt beside the wreck of the first tank. Silence rolled over the ridge. No more engines, no more machine gun bursts. Only the ragged breathing of three men who had witnessed something impossible. A single soldier, with a banned homemade launcher, had stopped an armoured advance. Miller broke the silence first. "Two tanks. Two. With that thing." Sandoval laughed breathlessly, half in shock. "Sir, you need to patent that after the war." Mercer didn't laugh. He stared down at the crippled vehicles below, smoke coiling upward like dark vines into the canopy. His arms felt heavy, his ears rang. His heart hammered in his chest with a mix of triumph and dread. Then he heard shouting, Japanese infantry moving along the trail. Dozens of them, maybe more. They were confused, disoriented, terrified by the sudden destruction of their armoured vanguard, but they were still advancing. Hart's distant voice crackled over the small field handset Miller had carried. "Mercer, did you get them? Tanks are offline, but infantry are regrouping. We need you back at the ravine now." Mercer slung the broken launcher across his shoulder. The metal scraped against his back. He looked at Sandoval and Miller. "Let's go. This isn't over." They moved through the foliage as the jungle roared back to life with gunfire. But Mercer felt something new inside him, a sense that fate for once was leaning their way. They had stopped the tanks, they had halted the armour. Now all that remained was surviving the infantry push. As they neared the ravine, Hart met them halfway, face streaked with soot and determination. "You did it, Mercer," he rasped. "But we've got one hell of a fight coming. Infantry massing for a charge. We're holding the line until reinforcements arrive." Mercer nodded, gripping the shredded launcher one last time before setting it gently on the ground. It had done its part. Now he would have to do his. He picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, and stood beside Hart as the jungle trembled with approaching footsteps. And for the first time in days, the squad believed they might live until morning. The jungle trembled long before the Japanese infantry appeared, the vibration of synchronized footsteps blending with the distant cries of birds startled into flight. Mercer crouched behind a tangle of roots at the ravine's edge, rifle steady, but heartbeat ungoverned. The air smelled of wet earth and burning oil, drifting from the wrecked tanks behind them. Smoke curled into the canopy like black question marks, reminders that the battle had shifted, first with surprise, then with desperation, and now into something rawer, survival. Hart raised a hand. The squad froze. Through the wavering heat rising from the ground, Mercer saw glimmers of movement, helmets bobbing between trees, shadows slipping from one patch of undergrowth to another. Japanese riflemen fanned out silently, disciplined, methodical, as if determined to erase the embarrassment of losing 2 tanks to a weapon they would have mocked had they ever seen it whole. Their officers barked clipped orders, trying to force momentum back into their hesitant ranks. The ravine formed a natural funnel. The Americans had the high ground, but only barely. Ammunition was low, morale hung by threads, and behind Mercer's position, lying beside a rock like a wounded dog, was the battered scrap metal launcher, its frame cracked, its cable frayed, its muzzle blackened beyond repair. Still, the sight of it steadied him. That thing had turned the impossible into fact. But facts could slip like water through fingers. There were no more canisters, no more shots, no more miracles from the machine. What remained now was human grit. Hart whispered, "Hold fire until they're close. Let them commit." The Japanese infantry formed 2 assault waves, one to probe, one to crush. They advanced slowly, bayonets fixed, rifles angled upward as if daring the ridge to fire too soon. Mercer steadied his breathing, counting heartbeats between each shifting shadow. Sandoval lay beside him, knuckles white against the stock of his rifle. Miller had positioned himself higher on the ridge, spotting their approach with eyes narrowed to slits. The first Japanese rifle cracked. A shot whistled past Mercer's cheek, nicking the bark behind him. Instinctively he ducked, heart hammering, but Hart's voice snapped like a whip. "Not yet!" The enemy crept closer, 30 yards now, bodies weaving through ferns, their movements so smooth they seemed part of the jungle itself. Then a second wave appeared behind them, more soldiers, pushing, urging, driving the front ranks uphill. Hart lifted his hand, paused. "Fire!" The ridge erupted. Mercer squeezed the trigger. His rifle kicked into his shoulder, spent casing flicking past his ear. Sandoval fired next, then Miller, then the rest of the squad. Bullets punched into the undergrowth, sending leaves erupting into bursts of green. Several Japanese soldiers fell immediately, but their formation didn't break. They surged forward with fierce determination, firing as they advanced, their return shots snapping through branches, kicking dirt where Mercer's elbows pressed the ground. Hart dropped beside Mercer. "They're committing! They're going full assault!" Through the chaos, Mercer spotted the enemy officer, a lieutenant with a sword sheathed at his hip and a Type 99 rifle raised high as he shouted his men onward. His voice cut through the gunfire, sharp, commanding. Then Mercer saw something else. 2 soldiers broke off from the main advance, circling right, moving low. They were attempting to flank, climbing toward an exposed gap in the ridge where the hillside thinned to loose gravel. If they reached that point, the squad would be overrun. Mercer signaled Sandoval. "Cover me, they're trying to climb the flank." Sandoval nodded and shifted position, delaying fire long enough to draw enemy attention. Mercer slid down the slope, boots slipping on damp roots, landing behind a fallen log just as a Japanese rifleman crested the ridge. Their eyes met, only a moment, but sharp as glass. The soldier lunged. Mercer fired, point blank. The man crumpled, sliding back through ferns. A second soldier appeared instantly, bayonet gleaming, thrusting downward. Mercer raised his rifle just in time, deflecting the strike, wood clashing against steel. The soldier pressed forward with surprising strength. Mercer shoved back, twisted, struck with the stock, and the enemy stumbled. A shot from Miller cracked overhead. The second soldier dropped, breathless. Mercer scrambled back uphill. Gunfire raged. Smoke swelled across the ridge. The first Japanese assault had stalled, but only barely. The second wave was forming behind the trees, shouting war cries that echoed off stone. Hart's voice cut through the confusion. "They're massing for a push! Get ready!" Mercer crawled to his position again, sweat dripping into his eyes. The enemy surged forward with sudden force, their rifles firing in steady rhythm. Bullets sliced through vines overhead, ripping leaves to ribbons. Sandoval cried out as a fragment grazed his arm, but he kept firing. Then came the terrifying sound, grenade spoons snapping free. "Down!" Mercer yelled. 3 grenades arced through the air, tumbling like black stones. One landed 10 feet away. Mercer grabbed Sandoval and rolled behind the thick log as the blast punched the earth, sending a rain of soil and shrapnel across their backs. Another grenade went off farther left, shaking Hart's position. The Japanese infantry roared forward. Through the blast haze, Mercer saw them reaching mid-slope, too close now for comfort. The ridgeline trembled as boots stomped through bamboo. The Americans fired in rapid succession, trying to break the second wave before it reached striking distance. Miller shouted from above, "They're climbing! The whole wave is climbing!" Mercer knew what that meant. If they reached the top edge of the ridge, the Americans would lose all cover. It would become hand-to-hand within seconds. He looked at the launcher lying beside the rock. Broken. Useless. Unless... No. It was madness. It would tear itself apart. It could explode in his face. There were no more canisters, but there was shrapnel from the grenades. There was a broken artillery shell casing near the last bend in the ravine, a dud from the Japanese advance yesterday. And there were vines, lots of vines. Hart shouted, "Mercer, we need fire on the left flank now, they're pushing through." Mercer made a decision without thinking. "Cover me!" He scrambled toward the launcher, grabbed it and dragged it behind the largest boulder. It was light now, too light, its metal loosened beyond safe use. He ripped a strip of vine, jammed it around a cluster of grenade fragments and metal shards he scooped from the dirt, then shoved them into the widened muzzle. It was crude, stupid, unstable, but so was war. He pulled the firing cable with all his strength. The launcher didn't fire. Clunk, jammed. Mercer cursed, checked the spring, pulled again. This time it shrieked as the cable whipped forward. A violent burst of sparks shot from the muzzle, and the improvised blast hurled its deadly cluster down the ridge. It exploded mid-slope with a jagged crack, fragments spinning outward like angry stars. The Japanese wave staggered, shouts of confusion, bodies falling backward, momentum broken. Hart saw it immediately. "Push them back! Now!" The squad fired with renewed fury. Mercer dropped the ruined launcher again. It was finished, split down the center, smoke seeping from its ruptured welds. But it had bought them the moment they needed. The Japanese infantry withdrew several yards, regrouping behind trees, shaken by the unexpected explosion. Their officers barked orders, trying to restore control, but hesitation had creeped into their movements. The psychological blow was deep. They had come prepared for rifles, for machine guns, for grenades. They had not come prepared for a man wielding a weapon built from the bones of the jungle. Reinforcement fire cracked from the west. American riflemen pushing through the underbrush, their silhouettes emerging like ghosts between trees. Groom himself appeared, shouting commands to the arriving platoon. The enemy heard it too, the sharp, unmistakable increase in American firepower. The Japanese lieutenant hesitated, blade gleaming at his side. He looked at the ridge, at the bodies, at the smoking wrecks of 2 tanks behind the Americans. Then he gave the order to retreat. The enemy line dissolved, soldiers withdrawing in disciplined waves until the jungle swallowed them entirely. No victory cry rose from the Americans, only relief, slow, trembling and wet like exhaustion breaking into rain. Hart fell to the ground beside Mercer, laughing breathlessly. "You insane son of a... Mercer, you did it. You absolutely did it." Mercer didn't laugh. He stared at the broken launcher half buried in dirt, its cracked frame still warm. The jungle breeze cooled the sweat on his neck. His hands burned with cuts he hadn't noticed. Groom approached, boots sinking into the mud, eyes locked on the shattered weapon. "Corporal," he said softly, "you may have just changed how we fight out here." Mercer shook his head. I didn't change anything. I just didn't want my men to die. Groom crouched, lifting the ruined frame gently. War doesn't care what you intended, it only remembers what worked. The squad gathered, battered but alive. Smoke curled from the ridge. The distant jungle had gone quiet again, as if holding its breath after witnessing something unbelievable. Hart clapped Mercer's shoulder. So, what do we call it now? Scrap metal launcher still accurate? Mercer looked at the twisted metal, at the weapon that was never meant to be, at the machine that had saved them and died doing so. No, he said quietly. It earned something better. The sun dipped behind the canopy, casting the ravine into amber light. Reinforcements secured the ridge. Medics tended the wounded. The battle was over. And in the silence that followed, the legend of Mercer's forbidden invention began, not in reports, not in newspapers, but in the tired voices of soldiers who knew they had survived because one man refused to accept the limits placed on him. Later, much later, when the war ended and men returned home, some carried scars and stories too heavy to tell. But those who had fought beside Mercer needed only one sentence to describe that day. They banned his scrap metal launcher until it crippled a Japanese tank crew and saved all of us.